Well, you all probably don't watch it, but do you? Well, anyway, the two guys they have white mothers and black dads, so they're kind of mixed heritage, and they do the skit where one of them does an impersonation of Obama, and the other is Obama's alter ego, who can be his anger guy. Have you seen that one? Oh, it is. It's so funny because President Obama is, he's so calm and collected and analytical, and so they have this guy playing Obama, and then this other guy, and he's fielding these questions, and so Obama is just calm and collected and gives his answer, and then this other guy is the alter ego, and he starts ranting and raving and shouting back at the people and calling them names, and as if that's what Obama's really thinking, but then he's keeping this calm, cool, collected. But these guys also do a substitute teacher skit where a black guy goes in as a substitute teacher into a well-to-do upper middle class school. Yeah, and he comes in, I've worked in the inner city for all these long. No, you're not going to get anything over on me. And then he starts with taking roll. And he's, where's Block A or Black A? Black A, where's Black A? And then the kid says, do you mean Blake? Oh, so you're going to play it that way, huh? And then there's Timothy, and then I heard him being interviewed on NPR, and he was talking about this skit, and that so many folks in the black community come up with these really strange names for their children, and some of it is trying to reclaim the heritage of African Americans who were enslaved and brought over to this country, and so many had to take on the names of the slave owners. And so we have lots of Washingtons and Jeffersons and so forth. And so these crazy first names is a way to reclaim, I'm not who someone else calls me or calls us. We are who we want to be. And so we come up with these unique names, and a lot of them are, Africanized things, but then others are just crazy. I mean, you could see, we see some in the hospital and some of these things where they make the paper. It was just, the family was just poor and very illiterate, and they just grabbed some name and they spelled it phonetically, but I mean, it's crazy. But they, let's see. But they did say, and this was a true story, there's one kid named Orangelo, and he says spelled Orangejello. That's what he had to go through life with. It's just that was on his birth certificate, but they said it was, it was one of the kids in their school. And so it was, anyway. So what that has to do with our Old Testament lessons are so many of the, well, we having more folks wander in. I'll do a little and get started. Oh my gosh, I forgot to throw my Bible in there, but I think I can find it. Anybody remember where we left off? Well, it's 14. Yeah. It was after Lot and Abraham separated, and they chose their own separate places, and Lot seemed to have picked the good land, and Abram took what was left over, and so Abram moved his tent, and he came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. That's where we ended up. And then at 14, and this is a whole long chapter, but the whole chapter is important to get the sense of it, and then it breaks down into parts that we look at individually. But the reason I brought up the names is in the days of King Amraphel of Shinar, King Arioch of Eleazar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goyim. These kings made war with King Bera of Sodom and King Birsha of Gomorrah, King Sinab of Admah, King Shemeber of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All of these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. Okay, so these 5 had been under the thumb of this one king, and then they rebelled on the 13th year, and in the 14th year, then Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and subdued the Rephaim and Ashtaroth-Karnaim and Zuzim in Ham and Emim and Shev. Anyway, a bunch of these things, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir as far as El Paran on the edge of the wilderness. And then they turned back and they came to En-Meshpat, that is Kadesh, which was a common time place understood by the writer and the ones who would hear this story. And they subdued all of the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who lived in Hazor Tamar. Now the commentary says that this is probably pretty common and understandable that they had these kings or princes of city-states, and and they would struggle for power and who was in control and so forth. And these 5 rebelled against the one ruler, but he had his allies, so it was 4 against 5. And they got together and and made this battle. But on the one hand, it said that was part of what was going on, but possibly they were really trying to keep their trade routes down to Egypt and other places open and clear, and didn't want to have people rebelling and therefore making it difficult to travel back and forth on their with their trade route. Anyway, then the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboim and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined battle in the valley of Siddim with King Chedorlaomer and Elam and King Tidal and Goim and King Amarath and Shinar and King Arioch of Eleazar, 4 kings against 5. And now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into these bitumen pits, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy, and that's kind of a loaded term, if the speaker calls one side the enemy, then that indicates whose side they're on. I mean, it's sort of like Missouri and Oklahoma State. If you're a sportscaster and you call one team the enemy, then you would kind of get a clue as to whose side you were on. And it reminds me of during election reporting when someone's reporting the results, and all of a sudden they're coming in, and one of the commentator lets slip. He says, "Oh, we're losing." Where he stands or she stands. So anyway, so the enemy took all of the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. And they also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who lived in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And then one who had escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. And when Abram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them. Now that's the men. When they give that number, then we've got, if these men were born in his household, then these men had mothers, and then they had sisters and younger siblings, which could also be male, and, grandparents and aunts and uncles who were not of fighting age. So it gives them an indication of a huge number in the household of Abram. Anyway, and then they went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and routed them and pursued them to the Hobah north of Damascus. And then he brought back all of the goods, and also brought back his nephew Lot with his goods, and the women and the people. So the enemy who captured these, the plunder and the booty, they also were taking slaves and people along with them. And Abram comes to the rescue. So, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheva. Oh, now we've got Abram is coming back from pursuing these other kings, and he's been victorious, and he's bringing them back. Now the king of Gomorrah comes out to meet him, which is an indication that one of the commentators said all of these crazy names that we're reading could very well be the lieutenants or the generals that the king has sent forth to do battle for them. And so this would indicate, yeah, that's so, because the king is home, and then when Abram brings these freed people back, the king of Gomorrah comes out to greet him. The king of Sodom comes out to meet him, but at Sheva, and this is the King's Valley, but then right here, there's an insertion, the king Melchizedek of Salem, not of Sodom. So, where's he come from? All of a sudden, he's just there. It's Melchizedek, but he's not the king of Sodom. It's somebody else. Which, this is a seam where we see this story and a report of Melchizedek is inserted into the narrative. You just plop right down there. This is a real obvious scissors and paste of the ancient Yahwist writer. But anyway, here comes Melchizedek of Salem, and he comes out with bread and wine to greet Abram, and he was also a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And then it cuts off there. And then the king of Sodom says. So this Melchizedek episode is dropped right in there. And then we go right back to this king of Sodom has come out to meet Abram in the Sheva, that is the King's Valley. And it picks up that part of the narrative. And he says to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." In other words, you freed my people from being enslaved, and you brought them back. But anyway, he's saying the people are more important than material things. Keep the material things for yourself as your reward, is essentially what he's saying. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, so that you might not say, 'I have made Abram rich.' I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Ashner, Azner and Eshcol and Mamre, let them take their share. So what we have here is Abram is saying, I'm not going to do this, but I'm not going to hurt the people who went with me. I'm not going to deny them their share of the booty and their reward for risking their lives to go on this expedition with me. But this is one of those things that it's showing, sometimes some people are very generous with things that are offered to them, and they don't realize that could hurt somebody else. It reminds me of you're in traffic and someone wants to be very magnanimous and stop and let somebody go. Well, while they're trying to communicate, you can go. Well, the other person's timid and doesn't want to go, but they keep waiting to let them go, and there's traffic stacking up. And sometimes those people is very dangerous because there's 4 or 6 lanes. They're in the middle lane. They're motioning someone to go, but they don't know cars are coming this way down that other lane that aren't going to let that person go. And if they go, they're going to get hit. So that person stays, but this person is just sitting there, saying, oh, come on, okay, you can go.
Maybe a bunch of back in the same lane, and they have just a dozen people.
Oh, yeah, it's just, those things happen. And then there's another one when my oldest sister, when my folks died, we had, settled the estate, and there was some money for all of us. It's not a huge amount, but she was a microbiologist, and he was a PhD chemist working for Eli Lilly in cancer research for his whole life. He has a huge pension. And my sister says, oh, we don't need that. Let's just give that inheritance away. Well, I'm not wealthy, and my son, who's a physician, has some medical school debt, and he says, what? That's why my dad, really, and they set up a trust, and it was a Tankersley family trust, and the intent of that money was for the grandchildren's education. And her kids, her 2 girls, didn't need it, but the rest of us did. But my sister was going to be so magnanimous. Well, since she didn't need it, let's give it all away. I said, wait, time out. You can give yours away, but we have, serious need because I don't have millions in my pension plan. So anyway. So those kind of things happen, but Abram is not that way. He's not forsaking that and then hurting his allies. He's saying, I won't take it, but my allies deserve their share of this. And so he does that. Let's see, where was I? I got down here. But Abram volunteers to give 1/10 of everything to Melchizedek, and then here comes the king of Sodom, and he offers him all this stuff, and then he says, let them take their share, and then that's the end of that part of the story. So this is the first place in the biblical account where the tithe comes up. And I've got a big discussion about all that at the end. So we'll come to that because it's very interesting how that processes. Was it a free will offering or was it obligatory? Because the king, Melchizedek, is a superior position, and Abram is an inferior position, and there's this whole custom of tribute and so forth. Anyway, but for all of this material that was in that chapter, this is kind of material that most of us will just skim right over and not bother reading. All those hard names and places, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it's hard to relate to. And a lot of them, we've never heard some of those names before and never will again, and there's no reference point. So it's real easy to skip over that. And I doubt that any of you have ever heard that as one of the lectionary readings which a pastor will preach from. It's only if you are looking for something new that nobody else has written about that you might have to dig into that. But anyway, a lot of biblical scholars do, because that's their job. They have to write a commentary on Genesis. Well, anyway, Von Rad calls this chapter one of the most difficult of all Old Testament passages because it takes us into ancient world history. It's a kind of stepping out of the biblical narrative that usually focuses on the patriarchs. But all of a sudden, it's talking about this 4 against 5 group of kings or princes, and they're having this battle and struggle over who's going to be in control of this area. And it doesn't really involve Abram until it gets right down to the end, when they have gotten involved with Sodom and Gomorrah and they capture Lot, and then Abraham has to go rescue him. But anyway, when we read about Abram in this story, in order to relate him to this story, he kind of changes into a different character. He's not really the pastoral kind of guy with, a few sheep and one wife, out there in the wilderness. He's got this huge bunch of folks and following. But not only that, these are well-trained and armed warriors that are ready to go out and pursue these kings who have this great alliance of, lots of numbers of fighters, and yet they go and attack and whip up on them. So it's a different image of who this Abram is in this story. He becomes a traveling prince of war instead of the guy sitting around his tent, moving his sheep periodically to new pasture. So anyway, it seems to be borrowing a lot of detail from another source of a secular chronicle of the battles between the kings and princes. And in that part, it's just kind of like a Sergeant Friday, just the facts, man, names and places. Don't want to get into characters or plots or anything. It's just this long list of things. But anyway, it's an isolated source that we don't find used in any other part of the Scripture, and it's not connected to any other source material. They found this and grabbed it and used it. But it is quite ancient in its origins, and it's very difficult to tie it to any particular historical time or event by way of our modern ways of understanding history. So it's either inserted by the Yahwist author or the redactor later on. It just slipped in there in the final editing that comes down to us. It has some attachment to historical persons and places, as I was talking earlier about the difficulty with the language. So many of these names are similar to and might refer to a lot of different people at different times, and so the scholars can say, well, it's probably referring to this one because the name is similar to some other name. But anyway, they have a lot of ink working out that. But to greater or lesser degrees, as the stories are told and passed on, they use the stories at different times for different purposes. The story carries some message or purpose, and each time it comes into a new age, it often takes on a new purpose, and sometimes they change the names in order to make connections and so forth. But even today, like I was saying earlier, we see changes in meanings of words, and names are really hard to understand with different spellings coming from different cultures. They sound the same, but they're spelled radically differently. Anyway, and then the oral tradition and then the written tradition. So the connection with history is very hard. Nevertheless, the final version in our Bible is still theological narrative with its own agenda, and it's different from all of the source material's agenda, even though it has ties and connections to some historical things. The first part of the passage, and this is the war or the battle of the 5 kings against the 4, each in the alliances. Our scholar Vaughter suggests that these names may be, as I mentioned a while ago, lieutenants acting in the interest of their lords, and it would be consistent with the time after the collapse of the city of Ur III in that time frame until the rise of Babylonian dominance under Hammurabi, when the Elamites were masters of the Sumero-Akkadian Empire and pretty much directed all of the Mesopotamian politics. So with the name connections, they're saying it could be from that period, that this does have a historical connection to what was really going on. For it is the king of Elam who heads this punitive expedition of Mesopotamian kings, that for 12 years Canaanite kings were subjects of the king of Elam. And this kind of event is very plausible, but it's improbable with these players, and at this time it's anachronistic. But this word Goim, G-O-I-I-M, rather than a real name, was simply a Hebrew word that meant many nations. And it may have been translated from the Akkadian term originally used to characterize various people, Elamites among the list of peoples who came, usually referring to invaders from beyond the pale of conventional and familiar society. So this term is used often when invaders come in, and he says it's much like the meaning of the Greek and Romans, what they would call the barbarians, the German tribes coming down from the north with power and attacking and looting and robbing and pillaging and so forth. So the long and the short is probably a historical remembrance rather than a total fabrication. But then the remembrance in this is used for other purposes. The geography of what's called the King's Highway describes the main centers of occupation around which these battles would probably be waged if they were struggling for power over these city-state kings to bring them back under the rule of one who wanted to be in control of it all. And this valley Siddim by the Salt Sea, or the lower Jordan Valley, where there are bitumen pits, and we know that's an oil-rich region of the world, so that's logical that would have a connection with, some historical remembrance. And, of course you would remember that. Yeah, they ran away and they got bogged down in these tar pits. And wasn't that funny? So, anyway, Vaughter, the scholar, says what we have before us seems to be a description of elaborate, and they call them R-A-Z-Z-I-A, which means raids, smaller and large raiding expeditions that are hit and run, highly mobile, erratic by design for the purpose of plunder and booty. They really weren't in the sense of, it's kind of mixing two things. The barbarians coming down to pillage and loot that cause a lot of trouble, but then a military expedition to bring people back under control are two different things, but they seem to have mixed those concepts because they're using similar military tactics. As they come upon a city, they ride in and they attack, and then because you've been disobedient, we're going to punish you, we're going to take your stuff. The itinerary of the invaders is not illogical, it's perfectly natural routes or routes. And then the final battle in the Siddim seems to be accomplished the goal to repress the rebellion of 5 kings in the city-state. But anyway, we have the weaving into this historical chronicle, the Abraham-Lot cycle, as it drops in and says, well, Lot lived in Sodom and he got captured. And so now he has to be rescued. And so who's going to rescue him? Well, Abram will go rescue him. And so we have the biblical narrative with its theological messages woven into that chronicle of ancient times. So Sodom and Gomorrah are defeated, and possessions of food and supplies are seized, and Abram's nephew, Lot, is taken. And then Abram's by his tent, minding his own business by the oaks of Mamre, and then a fugitive brings Abram news. And commentators say fugitives inevitably are ones who bring defeat to the loser. Now, Abram really wasn't a loser, but he's connected with the losing side. And so it's a fugitive who brings the bad news, someone who runs away from the battle or plays dead and gets up later and runs home to tell the bad news. So Abram goes forth to rescue Lot and bring back Lot and a whole bunch of plunder and booty. But then we have this commentary that slips in here. It says, Abram the Hebrew. Now, each one of the scholars stops right there and wants to do a big discussion about the word Hebrew because it has different meanings in the history. We think it just refers to the Jews. Yeah, right. That's one of the meanings, but it's a word that changes its meaning over time. It says the Israelites did not use the term for self-identification. It was bestowed upon them by others. Hebrews not convertible or translatable with Semite, Arab, or Israelite. It's not an ethnic determinant. Hebrew was a social designation like slave and not connected with any ethnic group or national group. However, the old cuneiform word of Habiru, Habiru, or Apiru, if H is silent, then you have Apiru. First, or the most ancient use found that Hapiru simply listed as foreign elements, foreign people in our territory from the 19th century before the Common Era. And then Habiru refers to prisoners of war destined for ransom in some cases. So still foreigners, but these are people captured, sort of like, the folks that were carried off that Abram rescued. Now, either they were carried off and held for ransom and could be bought back or taken into slavery. We're not sure, but wherever they're taken, then they would be foreigners where they arrived. The 18th century Amorite text, Habiru, refers to mercenary soldiers. Again, foreigners, but a different role. They're not slaves, but mercenary soldiers. An Amari text refers to enemy marauders. Again, foreigners, but marauders, barbarians coming in. In Hammurabi, in Babylon, Habiru equaled marauders, but marauders in the employment of the king sent out like mercenaries. And again, they're not native folks, they're foreigners who have made themselves available. 15th and 14th century Habiru, marauders again, but foreigners in the service of a king, and some sell themselves into slavery to improve their social and economic security. So this could be if they happen to be, like the herding folks who live on the margins and move from place to place, if there's a drought or disease or something and they lose most of their flock and they're impoverished, then they may sell themselves to the people of the city to be used however. And sometimes if they're in the midst of wars and stuff, then they turn them into mercenaries. So that word is applying to all of these different cases, but never a specific social or never a specific ethnic group or tribe, but more or less this social group that are foreigners in our midst who take on different roles and services as needed by the ruling people. So so we're not real sure what Hebrew means in that case, except we would assume it would mean that Abram was a foreigner by whoever's telling the story. It comes probably from some source of the Abram-Lot cycle that they would use that word to identify him. So anyway, so we move into the Abraham rescue of Lot part of the story, and we come up with this 318. And so, again, that's an interpretation issue. Is 318 a big number, or is it a small number? Relative, yeah. It's a big number to us because of the way we've kind of imaged Abram and Sarah by themselves with a few little sheep out in their tent, out under the grand sky when God comes to talk to them. But we have all these other stories that he's the head of a big tribe or clan of many, many people. So that makes it kind of a big number. But in comparison to the other kings, who probably had bigger masses of people, then it seems like a small number. And with a small number of very well-trained fighters, they're able to whip up on and beat the larger Mesopotamian kings. I mean, there were 4 of them, 4 kings and all their resources. But Abram he also had 4, his 3 allies groups. But if we look at it as a large number, as a big raiding party of a warrior prince, then it would show Abram's ability to win the allegiance of these other people who would trust him as a leader going into battle. So it's, a badge of honor or recognition looked at that way, that he has a reputation as a skillful warrior, someone you can trust your life under. But we're told that it's a guerrilla operation of repeated strikes against an army that's trying to go home after a long deployment. And it mentions the attacks, they divide up and they attack at night. So that's, indicating a guerrilla warfare. And the enemy is worn down. And in one sense, we could interpret that they are persuaded to abandon a certain amount of their booty, give them back Lot and the stuff they've gotten from Sodom. And so, here, take this and leave us alone, and you can go in peace. We want to go home. We're tired of fighting. We want to go home. And so, here, take this stuff and leave us alone, is one way that could be interpreted as possibly happening. And then on Abram's return from rescuing Lot, he meets in this valley of Sheva, the plain of the king's plain outside of Sodom. And and then we really get into the patriarchal story and the theological issues. This valley would be Valley of Kings, relating real close to Jerusalem, and the association in the mind of the writer and the people hearing the story are going to be thinking David's time. And so this Melchizedek, this king of Salem, that's going to trigger a thought of Jerusalem. And this king is both king and priest, And that's not uncommon in Near East and Middle East times of this historical time, that kings would perform priestly functions. And also David and Solomon did so within the Hebrew times. But this Melchizedek, this Zedek as a part of the name, is a god equivalent to the Greek god Dike, which is the god that represents justice or righteousness. And so that justice and righteousness connected with Jerusalem and Salem and Jerusalem is a connection that the Jewish folks or the Israelites would find very acceptable. Justice is my God, as the king of Salem would say. And then in Isaiah 121, Isaiah refers to Jerusalem where Zedek once lodged, that is, righteousness and justice once lodged there in Jerusalem, but now it's inhabited by murderers, as Isaiah is condemning current conditions, but refers to a better time in the past. And so the Yahwist brings Abram and Jerusalem into association. Abraham, the father of Israel, is associated with this place that will become the holy city of David. And Abraham receives a blessing from a Jerusalemite priesthood. And from this story, Melchizedek becomes a model or a symbol for the prototype of priest and king ideal. And then in our New Testament book in Hebrews, it's applied to Jesus as, like Melchizedek, is our priest and king, as the book of Hebrews does some really abstract kind of theologizing about who Jesus is and what his nature is and so forth, reaches back and grabs Melchizedek, priest and king image. So Von Rad sums up and states the purpose of the story connects Abram with Jerusalem and a blessing from a priest king, and it identifies with the God of Israel, even though Melchizedek is a Canaanite and his God probably isn't in his mind Yahweh, the Israelite God, but the names of Creator and God Most High are easily interchangeable with the Israelite folks to hear that, and would just assume, well, this pagan king really is worshiping our God, but he doesn't know it. But we do, because we're smarter than they are. And we can see through it. It will later come to be revealed to them. But anyway, and then Abraham receives this tribute and response of a king, showing him gratitude and homage and great respect. And then the offering of the 10% tithe to Melchizedek is a religious offering, and it's due at the altar and support of the priesthood. And Melchizedek blesses Abram for his service of pursuing and defeating the invading kings. So all of this is enhancing Abraham's image and his place in their minds. In a sense, it's, even though this is before they've had a child and they've grown into a great nation, this is a story that's saying already there were these signs pointing to the greatness that he will become. This king is even recognizing it and honoring him this early in the story. And then, it could be a thank offering because it comes after the offer of the tithe. Could be a thank offering because Melchizedek has said that the God Most High has put the enemy into your hands. But anyway, that interpretation could be read into that. Let's see. Before the Israelites, Melchizedek unknowingly is praising their God, and then the Hebrews uses that. Okay, well, we've got some more things to move into in the summary, and I'll start that to start, and then I've got 1, 2, 3 pages where I deal with this tithing and all the different ways that we pick up and use that and interpret it and how we might interpret it. Where, like I said, this, as you pointed out, this was the first place in the Bible of starting in Genesis where tithe is mentioned, and then how it's used, and it is used in association with worship and praising God and honoring God's people. Well, we got 5 minutes before we need to do any other questions or ideas, thoughts for the good of the crowd. Oh, that's one of the writers, because he's the one who uses the name Yahweh, and that's the source of a lot of these stories, that we can identify the style, other parts of style, but one of the main ones is he's the one that uses Yahweh as, or the abbreviated 4 letters. And then another one uses Elohim a lot, and we call him the Elohist. So you see, he uses that name for God, and then he has some other characteristics, and that's another part of the source. And then the priestly part, they sometimes use Yahweh as well, but that's a particular style that's very different. That's the first chapter, the daily part, that's very organized. And then the Yahwist in the creation story goes to the Adam and Eve, very folk-like story. And then Deuteronomist is an influence we haven't hit yet, but that's another whole bunch of source material for the Old Testament, or the first 5 books. And then the big R would be the one who gathered all of those together and wove them together and integrated them, and also has some commentary, introductory, or the seams where the pieces are put together. There's a sentence or two that ties them together. That author or redactionist is the source of those. It wasn't borrowed from any prior stuff. That's the work of the editor as he pulls it together. And so we see that hand on this. And some argue that the priestly version was also the redactionist, who the priestly version had their part and then wove the other parts in, but that's a minor opinion. The majority think that there were these others and then a redactionist that put it together. Well, I've run out of steam. So let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for all the ways you do bless us, and that there were people way back when who thought it was important